Hey guys, welcome back to another week of Behind and Beyond. This week we're sitting down with Amanda and we're having a really awesome conversation continuing through our series on the book of Esther. A few things you can expect to hear. We talk about pride, the signs of it, and how destructive it can be to our lives. We go through what it looks like to reconcile this idea of an invisible God in our visible lives. We also have a really helpful conversation about lamenting and the difference between lament and grief in our lives. It's a really awesome conversation. I can't wait for you to hear it. So let's get into it. Hey, Amanda, welcome back.
Hey, great to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. This is so fun.
It's so fun. I love having you here. I love getting to talk with you. If anyone doesn't know, me and Amanda work together pretty much every day. So this is just another conversation for us.
Yeah,
but
on the record.
We have a lot to talk about. How was this weekend? How was going through Esther?
Great. You know, Esther has been a really fun journey. When I found out we were going to study this book, I was excited because I've never done a deep dive into Esther before. And as I've been studying, I'm like, oh man, I wish I was teaching more in this series. But had this week, the third week, and it's been interesting because, you know, you read narrative kind of at face value and it's a story and it's an interesting story. But then you realize like, oh my goodness, what am I going to pull out of here?
Yeah.
That like, what is God trying to say through this to us? And I think teaching has been really instructive to me personally, even just how to read the Bible, because a lot of times, especially reading narrative or Old Testament narrative, I read through it and I grasp the story and maybe think about some things, but don't really stop and dig like, okay, Lord, what are you trying to speak through this passage? And teaching has forced me to really dig in. And for a couple of weeks, it was like, okay, crickets. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to teach through this passage. It's just all about this really evil person. What does that look like? And then the more you sit with it and the more you just like pick it apart line by line, God begins to speak. And so it's really taught me a lot, even just about my own personal Bible study. And there's really nothing special or unique when I teach other than just digging in. And that's something we can all do. I think it's just a fun encouragement to like really dig in to every passage and see like, Lord, what are you trying to speak to me today through this text?
What was that difference for you? Was it just like time or persistence, or like for someone who's like, I'm reading this over and over again and there's just, I'm getting nothing. Like, what would you encourage them with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first reading it by yourself and just sitting with it and seeing what's interesting, what stands out. Like in this case, to me, the king's conversation with Haman, like why didn't he ask any questions? That's bizarre. Like, so just like making notes of things like that. And then I think there's so much accessible online. Dave mentioned the Bible Project is a great resource, but there's so many resources, even at ESV Study Bible, to just begin to like uncover a little bit more and think, okay, this is about how much 10,000 talents is, or this is why the Jews and the Agagites hated each other, or just, so there's insights that I wouldn't know historically that then those begin to come into the mix. But those are tools available to all of us. Like I don't just have a working knowledge of the ancient Persian Empire. You know, you have to dig into that. So,
and there's so much that I think is revealed through those details too. Like it's just, you can think, oh, what's the value in learning like what 10,000 talents would be equivalent to? But so often, like I feel like God reveals himself in those details when we just take that time to dig in a little more.
Yes. And so I think that's my encouragement to just us, even as a church, is like, when was the last time you sat with a passage, especially one that isn't, you know, as obvious. A lot of Paul's letters are much more obvious application and we can make that jump. But Old Testament, I think sometimes is like, okay, I don't necessarily see anything here right off the bat, but to really dig in, I think God just brings things to light and it's so rich. Like there's so much. I always start off with nothing and then I have way more than what could ever fit into a 35-minute sermon.
Yes, I'm sure. What are some things we could dive into that you wanted to cover this weekend that just weren't able to make it in?
I think a big one for me, it was like a whole point that I had written out that then I ended up cutting for time, was Haman's pride and how we see throughout the entire book that ultimately leads to his downfall. But that's an enemy tactic, you know, to use my framework from this weekend, that Satan comes after us with trying to appeal to our pride. And, you know, I quote Tim Keller all the time because I love him. But one quote that he has about pride is that pride is the carbon monoxide of sin because it kills us slowly without us even knowing it. And
that's good. Yeah.
Because like, if you think about it, if you're committing adultery, you know you're committing adultery. Or if you're lying or embezzling or whatever it might be, you know that's exactly what you're doing. But when we have pride in our hearts, it's hard for us to detect, especially because I think living according to God's word often helps us weed out some of those other vices or sins because we're trying to look more like Jesus and we're being sanctified. But sometimes that's the very thing that fuels pride. And so that's why it's so sneaky. And Haman had that concentration on himself. Like it's thinking about yourself, and pride can be insecurity, inferiority or superiority. It can be on either end of the spectrum, where you become so consumed with yourself and how other people view you that you're blinded to everything else. And even in Esther 6, later on, we'll see that pride become his downfall when the king comes to him and says, what should I do with a man that I want to honor? And Haman, of course, thinks that's himself and then plans this big thing. And we'll see the reversal as we get there. But just the dangers of pride, and it really made me search myself. And I think it is an encouragement to us when we see the character of Haman, where, like, are we living inside of a room with that carbon monoxide of pride? And how might it be killing us? How might it be killing our relationships and our relationship with the Lord? Like that self-righteousness creeping in and thinking we're so good at being good or so good at following Jesus that we don't really realize it's just pride killing us from the inside out.
Wow. Yeah. What are some like signifiers of pride? Like what are some byproducts that we should be on the lookout for?
I think the way we think about criticism in two ways. One, if a criticism crushes you, that's that inferiority side of pride, where someone's opinion of you has been elevated to a point that's not healthy or good. Or if you just can't accept or take any criticism. If somebody comes to you and you're like, well, I'm not even going to consider that. There's no way that's possibly true. That's a place, I think, when we evaluate our own hearts and can't find sin or places of growth and just think like we've arrived even spiritually. I do think that self-righteousness for a lot of us is where pride creeps in. Maybe another one is just, I know for me, constantly wrestling down the battle with other people's approval and being fed by that. And, sometimes it's like, oh, my whole day can be made if I get this one person's approval, or I feel like I was successful if they say something about this, or, work really hard to please certain people. And another quote I heard as I was thinking about pride is that pride is wanting praise from the praiseworthy, like at our hearts, like who we deem to be praiseworthy, really wanting their praise. And, that takes our eyes off of Jesus and his praise and his acceptance, one that he's already given us, but two that we're seeking as we follow him. And so I think that's another place that pride creeps in without us recognizing it.
That's really good. Along those same lines of things that can creep in without us recognizing, we talked a lot about the whole concept of an invisible God. And I think that's like on a positive end of the spectrum of, you shared that precious quote from your son about, why doesn't God just make himself visible? Like, why can't we just see him? That'll make it so much easier. How do you yourself wrestle through that concept of an invisible God? Like, how do you, I guess, not to make it such a big question, but how do you encourage yourself or encourage your family to like seek God and trust his goodness even when you don't see it?
That is a big, hard question. And I think as a parent, our kids ask us things all the time that really are getting to those like basic core tenets of belief in our theology. And so how do we think about an invisible God? Or my daughter asks all the time, like, Mommy, how do you know that God is real? Like, how do you actually know that if you can't see him? And it's that tension between like, yes, it requires faith. The Bible is super clear that that's an element, and we're never going to be like, yes, because of this thing that I tangibly see, then I know that God is real. Like that isn't necessarily something. But then on the same end, God is so good and gracious that his Holy Spirit does speak to us, and we have those moments where we know we're connecting with the Lord. But to bring it back to Esther, it is looking back and seeing, I can look back through my life and see God's hand all through it. And it's amazing to look back and see that. Actually, after church on Sunday, I was connecting with a couple, and they're probably heading into retirement, like more around that age. And we were just talking about that very thing, like seeing God. And they said, the older you get, the easier that becomes. And that faith in those decree moments becomes easier too, because you have something to hold on to. And so even I think with my kids all the time is pointing out, like, where have we seen God work? Where have you felt like Jesus with you? How can you know that he can be trusted because of what we've seen? And that's the book of Esther too. It's just, you see God's hand all the way through. And we have, the ability of hindsight that they didn't have in that time. But we also have, the end of our own story that we have redemption fully in Jesus. And so we know that's coming, but how do we live like in light of that now?
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, those decree moments are so vital in like reminding us of truth and pointing us back to the goodness of God in so many ways. What about on the other side of it, like for someone who's going through a decree moment that's maybe negative, how would you encourage them, or how have you encouraged yourself, like in those moments that are, you know, really kind of earth shattering, like you talked about? They can shatter if you allow them to, they can shatter your confidence in that goodness of God. How are you encouraging yourself? What are you going back to in scripture or in your own life? Or who do you seek out for that encouragement, whether it's your husband, your family? How do you navigate those more trying times?
That's a great question. There's lots of ways. I do think, we hit on lament in the sermon, and that's something we don't talk about a ton, but I do think we all have moments where we need that expression, that biblical expression that God has given us to cry out to him with such honesty. And I love even the quote I shared this weekend talking about how like sometimes we think that giving God the silent treatment is like going to make everything feel better, but that's actually what pushes him away and what kills our faith. And when we're inviting God into that and saying, I am so mad, this is so hard, this feels unfair, I don't understand, God, like just all of those honest cries of our hearts. And that's why I love, and even ended with a psalm this weekend, because David did have such a well-developed liturgy of lament in his life. And I'm pretty sure all but one of his lament psalms come back to that hope and faith in the goodness of God. So you see him always saying like, my heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. I'm going to say, how long, O Lord, but I see your goodness in this. And so in those moments where we feel like, how long, O Lord, to go and say that to him. And that's where those paths come into play, because if we're not lamenting and if we're not going to God, we are going somewhere else, all of us. And we probably all have, some that we tend to run down in those moments of confusion more than others. So I think it's knowing and having the people around you know what paths you tend to take. And so if control, like if life is spiraling out of control and you're grasping for control, to having those people you love and trust in your life saying like, it seems like you're really trying to control these things here so that this thing over here that feels so out of control won't feel out of control. Or I've noticed that you're turning, you're having a bottle of wine every night, and that's like not okay because you're turning to that to try to numb this. And so like just having people in your life that you trust enough to point those things out to you. And to know yourself too, like, these, even in moments where you're not spiraling into confusion, like where do I tend to go? Do I tend toward control? Do I tend toward despair? Do I tend toward denial because I want life to be great? Do I tend toward doubt and going inward and not letting anyone else like help me process that well?
Yeah. And remember that there's no like neutral path. Like I thought that was such a key thing of what you said. It's like, we're not like, the car doesn't just sit in neutral. Like you're either driving forward or you're in reverse, and if you're going backwards, you're on one of these paths of destruction, even though they can be so sneaky and it can feel like, oh no, I'm just like, I'm just coasting. Like I'm just, like all those lies you talked about, even with like parenting of like, oh, like, I'm not going to cover spirituality with my kids yet. Like we'll just get to that later. But like not choosing that path of righteousness is choosing a path of unrighteousness, even though we can convince ourselves that it's not the case. Yes. So I think that's such a good point to remember. Yeah,
that's a great way to even say that. Like you're either going forward or you're going backward. And that's where those paths, I do think, come into play, because we think that those are our paths out of the confusion, but they're only going like deeper. They're actually just taking us back into it instead of walking forward with the Lord. Yeah.
Are there any other paths? I mean, you mentioned a lot, but I didn't know if there was like any other ones that you feel like we can kind of fall trap to or victim to. It's okay if not.
Yeah, no, I think, I know I hit on this already, but there is like the approval of others, or, if the fear of man is part of what's causing the confusion, to like, if I just appease this person, or if I get enough support and love from them, then this confusing moment doesn't seem so confusing anymore. So I think turning even to like unhealthy places in our relationships. And again, a lot of those things in both of those enemies' traps, they do come from a legitimate need. Like when we feel like we're spiraling from a decree moment, we are like running towards something.
Yeah.
But we're just meeting it in the wrong way.
Yeah. No, that's so true. What are things like if you're kind of in denial about a path you're on? Like I remember Dave talked about earlier about deception, how like the whole point of deception, it sounds so elementary, is that you don't know you're being deceived. Like you're unaware of it. So for someone who like maybe doesn't have that community around them, are there like some self-tests that you would do for that? Or I guess, how would you identify that path? Like, what does it look like to sit down and kind of self-evaluate? Like, okay, I'm losing control. I want to grasp onto control. Like, I guess, what do I need to do instead, if that makes sense?
That's a great way to think about it, because so often, maybe we don't even want to let people into those moments yet. They're really raw and fresh, and we don't even know how to begin to do that. I really think it's asking the question, like, am I walking with Jesus in this? And deep down, that's a really easy litmus test, because we all know, like, yes, even if it's, yes, I'm walking with Jesus and I'm really angry at him and I'm going to tell him, he's still right there walking through the valley with me.
Yeah.
But if it's, no, I have pushed him out or given him the silent treatment or maybe written him off because I'm mad at him and he must not be real, then you're walking alone. And so I think that's at the root of all of these is my desire to figure out this moment by myself, whether it's control or pleasure or despair or denial or isolation. And so Jesus is not present in those things. And so like, is Jesus on this path with me? When we come back to that question, then we know, like, am I going to keep walking? Am I walk the path of trust?
Yeah. Oh, it's so frustrating. Like, why? I don't know why we do that. When you think about it and you're like, why do I know this isn't good for me. And I know I can't walk through this alone, but yet we like just keep returning back to it.
Yes.
We're like, oh no, I'm going to try it this time.
No, and totally. And that's where
myself.
That's where the deception comes in because it's like, no, like, or it's not that big of a deal, or I've got this one handled. And there are so many times, even when I'm walking through something that's not like a crisis decree moment, but just a frustrating circumstance in my life, I begin to like spiral deeper into confusion, maybe saying, what if, or playing out those worst case scenarios in that path of despair. And I will catch myself like, why have I not even, like, I haven't even prayed about this or asked the Lord, like, where are you in this? Show yourself to me. I just jump like right into that. And it's so foolish, but it's something like that's our natural tendency. Yeah, for sure. As we start to wrap up, I'd love to know, since you sadly don't get to preach on Esther again, but you've gotten to study the book, it's so in depth. Is there anything that you want to talk about just over the course of Esther as a book, as a full narrative that really has stood out to you, that God has revealed to you that you'd love to share now? Yeah, I get to go on a sabbatical in May. Ooh-hoo. So I will be out for the rest of this series. But to me, like at the core of Esther, in addition to God's hidden hand, is that God redeems his people. Our redemption is sure. And so even in a chapter that's all about the enemy, maybe your story right now feels like it is all about that battle with the enemy. Our redemption's sure. God redeems his people. That enemy in the book of Esther, he loses at the end of the day. He does not get what he is after in terms of the people of God. And our enemy, even though he's coming after us now and scheming and accusing and lying and who has all these tactics that we looked at, he does not get the last word. He does not get the victory. We know, like, Esther and her people they had the promise of God protecting his people, but they didn't know how their story was going to end up. We know how our story is going to end up. And so all of those decree moments will be reversed. Like the great reversal that we see in Esther again and again, we will experience the great reversal in the new heavens and the new earth, where there's no more tears or crying or sickness or death. And so it's just a word of encouragement that wherever you are, whatever path you find yourself on today, that you are God's child and your redemption is sure. That's so good. Such an encouraging word to end on. Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. This was fun. So fun. Thanks for being here as always. And thank you guys for listening, for watching, and we will see you next week. Bye guys. See ya.